The morning my granddaughter came home with a bruise on her wrist, I was sitting on the back porch drinking my second cup of coffee. She was 11 years old. She walked past me without saying a word, and that was how I knew something was wrong. Emma always said good morning. Always. Even on the worst days of her young life, she would find me on that porch and say, "Good morning, Grandpa." That morning, she walked straight past me, shoes still on, backpack still over one shoulder, and went directly to her room. I set down my coffee. I looked at the door she had walked through, and something that had been sleeping inside me for a very long time began to wake up. Let me back up. My name is Richard Calloway. I am 67 years old. I spent 31 years working for the Internal Revenue Service, not as a desk clerk, not as a tax preparer, but as a special agent in the Criminal Investigation Division. For more than 3 decades, I tracked financial crimes. I built cases against money launderers, tax fraudsters, embezzlers, and organized crime figures who thought their accountants had made them untouchable. I put men in federal prison who had never once in their lives believed that anyone could touch them. I was good at my job. I was very good at my job. When I retired, I moved back to Dayton, Ohio, where my daughter Sarah lived with her husband and my granddaughter Emma. My wife Carol had passed 2 years before my retirement. Pancreatic cancer. 11 weeks from diagnosis to the end. After she was gone, I realized there was nothing keeping me in Washington. Sarah was my only child. Emma was my only grandchild. So I sold the house in Virginia, loaded what mattered into a truck, and drove west on Interstate 64 until it became Interstate 70, and I kept going until I reached Dayton. I rented a small house 12 minutes from Sarah's. Nothing fancy. 2 bedrooms, a back porch, a yard that needed work. I planted tomatoes in the spring. I learned to make Carol's pot roast from her handwritten recipe card. I walked every morning at 6. To look at me, you would see exactly what people expected to see. A retired old man living quietly, causing no trouble, taking up very little space in the world. My son-in-law Daniel was a good man. I want to make that clear, because this story is not about him. Daniel worked in logistics management for a distribution company. He was steady, honest, and he loved Sarah in a way that was plain to see, even when he thought no one was watching. He was not flashy. He was not rich. He drove a 5-year-old Hyundai and packed his lunch every day and coached Emma's soccer team on Saturdays. He was exactly the kind of man I had hoped my daughter would marry. His father was another matter entirely. Gerald Whitmore had made his money in commercial real estate. He was 70 years old, broad-shouldered. With silver hair he wore combed back, like he was still in 1987. He had the kind of tan that comes not from outdoor work, but from deliberate leisure golf in Arizona, a boat in Florida, a condo somewhere warm that he mentioned too often. He had been divorced twice. He drove a black Mercedes SUV and replaced it every 2 years. He had opinions about everything and shared them without invitation. I had met Gerald several times before things came apart. At Emma's birthday parties. At Thanksgiving. One year, when Daniel and Sarah had everyone over. At Emma's school play. Each time, Gerald and I were cordial. We shook hands. We talked about nothing in particular. He asked me once what I had done for work, and when I said I had been with the IRS, he laughed the way men laugh when they are not actually amused. "Tax man," he said. "Well, somebody has to do it." He turned away before I could respond. That was fine. I had spent my career being underestimated. I had learned that being underestimated was often useful. What I did not know then, what I would learn later, piece by piece, the way I had always learned things was that Gerald Whitmore had very specific reasons to be uncomfortable around anyone connected to federal law enforcement. He simply did not know that I was connected in any way that mattered. To him, I was a retired file pusher, a gray-haired nobody who happened to be his son's father-in-law. Harmless. He was still telling himself that story the morning the agents knocked on his door. But I am getting ahead of myself. The trouble started approximately 8 months before that morning, at a Sunday dinner at Daniel and Sarah's house. It was early October. Emma had a soccer game in the morning and they had won, and she was still wearing her uniform when we all sat down to eat. She was talking about a save she had made. She played goalkeeper, and her eyes were bright, and her cheeks were still flushed from running. I watched her and thought about Carol, who had had the same expression when she was excited about something. The same way of leaning forward slightly, like she wanted to get closer to whatever was making her happy. Gerald arrived late. He came through the front door without knocking, which I had noticed he did as a habit. He set a bottle of wine on the counter that no one had asked for, kissed Sarah on the cheek in a way that always seemed slightly performative, and sat down at the head of the table. Daniel sat at the other end. I sat to Daniel's right. Emma sat across from me. The conversation moved around the table. Gerald talked about a property deal he was working on in Cincinnati. He talked about the golf tournament he had played in last weekend. He talked about a restaurant he had been to in Columbus that he thought was overrated. He talked the way some men do continuously, filling silence the way water fills a container, taking up every available space. Emma, who had been animated all afternoon, grew quieter as the meal went on. I watched her. She picked at her food. She stopped telling her story about the soccer game halfway through, when Gerald interrupted to say something about a professional match he had watched on television. He did not seem to notice that he had cut her off. Or perhaps he noticed and did not care. After dinner, Emma went to the living room with her tablet. Gerald followed Daniel into the kitchen to talk about something. I helped Sarah clear the table, and then I walked into the living room to sit with my granddaughter. She had headphones on, watching something. I sat beside her on the couch. After a minute, she pulled one side of the headphones off and looked at me. "Grandpa," she said, "why does Grandpa Gerald talk so much?" I thought about that for a moment. "Some people fill silence because silence makes them uncomfortable," I said. "It doesn't mean there's nothing wrong with you. It means there's something they're working through." She considered this. "He told Dad that their house needs to be bigger," she said. "He said it in front of me, like I wasn't there." I looked at her. "When did he say that?" "Last week, when he came over to pick something up. He walked through the whole downstairs, and then he said to Dad, 'You really should think about upgrading. Like a bigger house would make you more impressive.'" She paused. Dad's face did a thing. "What kind of thing? Like when you're trying not to look hurt?" I stayed with her for another half hour. When I left that night, I drove home slowly and sat in my car in the driveway for a while before going inside. Something was stirring. I recognized the feeling from work, the early sense, before you have any proof, that something beneath the surface is wrong. I had learned never to dismiss that feeling. Over the following months, I began to pay closer attention. Gerald came around more frequently than I would have expected. He had opinions about Daniel's career. He thought Daniel should be making more money by now, should be looking at management positions that paid better, should be thinking more seriously about the future. He said these things in front of Sarah. He said them in front of Emma. He said them with the particular confidence of a man who has confused financial success with wisdom. Daniel absorbed it. That was who Daniel was, a man who kept the peace, who did not escalate, who believed that patience was the right response to difficult people. I respected that, but I also watched it cost him something each time. The situation with Emma was what changed everything for me. It happened on a Saturday in February. Gerald had insisted, really on taking Emma to a museum in Columbus for the day. Sarah and Daniel thought it would be good for Emma to spend time with her grandfather, and Emma was curious about a dinosaur exhibit that was running through the spring. They said yes. Gerald brought her home 4 hours later. Emma walked in the front door, said she was tired, and went to her room. Gerald stood in the doorway and told Sarah they'd had a wonderful time. He left within 5 minutes. I was not there that afternoon. Sarah called me that evening, her voice careful. "Something happened today," she said. "Emma won't tell me exactly what, but she said Grandpa Gerald got angry in the car. She said he was yelling on the phone to someone the whole drive there, and then in the museum she accidentally knocked over a display card, and he grabbed her arm and told her to pay attention and stop embarrassing him." I was quiet for a moment. Grabbed her arm. She has a small bruise on her wrist. "Sarah, I know. Have you talked to Daniel? He's furious." He called his father. Gerald said Emma is being dramatic, that he barely touched her, that kids today are too sensitive. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, carefully, "Sarah, I want you to do something for me. I want you to take a picture of Emma's wrist tonight with a timestamp. Will you do that?" There was a pause. Dad, should I be worried? Take the picture, I said. And don't tell Gerald you've done it. That was the beginning. Over the next 3 weeks, I did what I had always done when something felt wrong. I started gathering information. I was not operating in any official capacity. I had been retired for 4 years. But I still knew people. 31 years in criminal investigation meant a network that did not simply evaporate when you turned in your credentials. I made some calls. Quiet calls. Casual conversations. The kind where you catch up with old colleagues and mention that you've come across a name that seems interesting. Gerald Whitmore. Commercial real estate. Based in Dayton. Operating in Columbus and Cincinnati. Within 10 days, I had a clearer picture. Gerald's business had expanded significantly in the previous 3 years, faster than his documented income and known assets should have reasonably allowed. He had purchased 4 commercial properties in 18 months, paid substantially in cash or through a series of LLCs with names that changed just often enough to be noticeable. His tax filings showed a business operating at the margins of profitability, which was inconsistent with his lifestyle. His lifestyle was inconsistent with everything. This was a pattern I had seen many times. It had a name. I also learned that Gerald was not on good terms with his business partners from a deal that had collapsed in 2019. One of those partners had filed a civil complaint that had gone nowhere, but the complaint contained details, transaction records, cash flows, allegations of misrepresented assets that were specific enough to suggest the person filing it had real information. That person had eventually walked away. People walked away from Gerald Whitmore. I was starting to understand why. I want to be honest about something here, because it matters. I did not go looking for information about Gerald because I wanted revenge. I went looking because my granddaughter had come home with a bruise on her wrist, and the man who put it there had called her dramatic, and I needed to understand who I was dealing with. When you have spent 31 years in federal law enforcement, you develop a particular relationship with information. You learn that most people who harm others in small ways are also causing harm in larger ways, in places where no one is looking. That turned out to be true of Gerald Whitmore. The situation at home continued to deteriorate. Gerald began involving himself in Daniel and Sarah's finances in a way that crossed from opinionated to controlling. He had apparently been lending Daniel small amounts of money over the years. This was new information to me, which told me Daniel had been too embarrassed to mention it. Now, Gerald began referencing those loans in conversations, not demanding repayment directly, but mentioning them, bringing them up in context, reminding Daniel of a debt Daniel had thought was a gift. He's using it to keep Daniel small, Sarah told me one evening, when Emma was asleep and we were sitting in her kitchen. Every time Daniel pushes back on anything, suddenly the money comes up, like he owns a piece of us. How much money are we talking about? I asked. She told me. It was not a small amount. It was enough to matter, enough to feel like a chain around Daniel's leg. Has it ever been put in writing? Any of these loans? No, she said. Gerald said he didn't need paperwork between family. I nodded slowly. That's useful to know. Sarah looked at me. She had Carol's eyes, the same directness, the same capacity to see through what people were saying to what they meant. Dad, she said, what are you doing? I'm listening, I said. That's not all you're doing. I looked at my daughter for a long moment. Gerald grabbed Emma's wrist and left a bruise, and then called her dramatic when she said it hurt. He is holding financial leverage over your husband to keep your family under his control. He is doing this because he believes he can, because he believes there are no consequences. Sarah was quiet. There are consequences, I said. I'm going to make sure of that. Dad. She paused. Are you going to do something that gets you in trouble? No, I said. And I meant it. Everything I was doing was legal. Everything I was going to do was legal. The difference between me and Gerald Whitmore was that I understood the law precisely enough to use it without breaking it. The next development came from a direction I had not anticipated. One of my former colleagues, a woman named Patricia, who had moved over to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, after leaving the IRS, called me back after I had left her a message. We talked for a while. I mentioned what I had found on my own. She mentioned that the name Gerald Whitmore had come up in something she was not at liberty to describe in detail, but that if I had documentation I thought was relevant, there were channels for submitting it that did not require me to be actively employed. I had documentation. I had been building it carefully for 6 weeks, the way I had been trained to build things methodically, with sources, with dates, with the kind of specificity that withstands scrutiny. I submitted what I had through the appropriate channel. I did not make any promises about what would happen. I simply put the information where it could be evaluated by people whose job it was to evaluate it. Then I waited. While I waited, things came to a head at home. It happened at Emma's school spring concert. She was playing the flute. She had been taking lessons for 2 years, and she had a small solo in the second piece. The auditorium was full. I sat in the third row between Sarah and Daniel. Gerald arrived late and sat in the row behind us. Emma performed beautifully. Her solo was short, maybe 30 seconds, but she played it cleanly, and her posture was perfect. And when she finished, she allowed herself a small smile that she tried to suppress, because she was trying to look professional. I wanted to stand up and applaud. I restrained myself. Afterward, in the lobby, families were taking photographs, and children were running around with their instruments. Emma found us, and she was glowing. She had done well, and she knew it. And she was at the age where knowing you have done well is still uncomplicated before doubt becomes a permanent resident. Gerald appeared at the edge of our group. He ruffled Emma's hair in a way that made her take a small step back. Then he turned to Daniel. "She needs better instruction," he said. "I know a teacher in Columbus, conservatory trained. What she's getting now isn't serious." Daniel started to respond. I spoke first. "She just performed in front of 400 people," I said. "And she was wonderful." Gerald looked at me. It was the first time I had ever directly contradicted him, and something shifted in his expression, a recalibration, the look of a man deciding how much weight to assign to an obstacle. "No one said she wasn't wonderful," Gerald said, with the patience of a man talking to someone who has missed the point. "I'm talking about her development. Long term. You have to think about these things." "She's 11, I said. "Exactly," Gerald said, as though I had agreed with him. He turned back to Daniel. "I'll send you the teacher's information. The lessons won't be cheap," but he paused, in a way that managed to be casual and pointed at the same time. "I can help with that." Daniel's jaw tightened. I watched it happen. The mechanism Gerald had built was working exactly as intended. Offer, create dependency, pull the chain. "Gerald," I said. He turned back to me. His expression now was something between amusement and mild irritation. "I think Emma is going to decide for herself what kind of instruction she wants," I said. "And I think Daniel and Sarah are going to support whatever she decides." Without additional input. The lobby was noisy. No one around us was paying attention. But between Gerald and me, the air was very still. "Richard," he said. He smiled, but it did not reach his eyes. "You're a sweet man. But some things are better left to people who understand how the world actually works." I looked at him for a moment. Then I nodded, once. "You may be right about that," I said. I excused myself to find Emma. I brought her a cup of punch from the refreshment table and told her that her solo had been the best part of the evening, which was true. She beamed at me. I held on to that, the way she beamed, and I carried it with me as I drove home. 2 weeks later, Patricia called me. I was on my back porch. 6 in the morning, first cup of coffee, the yard still gray with early light. When her name came up on my phone, I set down the cup. "The package you submitted," she said. "There were people here who were already looking in the same direction. What you put together filled in some gaps." "How significant?" I asked. "Significant enough," she said. "I can't tell you more than that, but I wanted you to know it was received and it mattered. And I want to tell you, whatever happens next, it will be handled by the right people through the right channels. You understand what I'm saying?" "I understand," I said. "You need to stay completely out of the operational side." "I know how this works," I said. "I spent 31 years doing it." There was a pause. "You were always thorough," Patricia said. "I forgot how thorough." After we hung up, I sat on the porch for a long time. The light came up slowly over the yard. The tomatoes I had planted last year had died in the frost, and I needed to replant. I made a note to do that. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she would have handled Gerald directly, without drama, with a precision that left no room for misunderstanding. She had been better at people than I was. I was better at paper trails. Together, we had been formidable. I thought, I am doing this for Emma. I am doing this for Sarah and Daniel. And I am doing this because Gerald Whitmore grabbed my granddaughter's wrist and called her dramatic when she said it hurt, and people who do that have almost always done worse things in places where no one was watching. I was right about that. The following month was ordinary on the surface. I had Sunday dinners with Sarah and Daniel and Emma. I watched Emma's soccer games. I planted the tomatoes. I did not mention Gerald unless asked, and I tried not to let anything show when he came up in conversation. This was not difficult. I had spent 31 years not letting things show. Gerald, for his part, seemed to have decided I was not worth his attention. At a family barbecue in early May, he spoke mostly to Daniel about business, and mostly to Sarah about the house, and to me he said perhaps 6 words, and did not bother to make them interesting. I found this fine. The best thing a person in his position could do was underestimate me. The worst thing was to believe that because I was quiet I was not watching. On a Thursday morning in the second week of June, I was in the kitchen making breakfast when my phone rang. It was Daniel. His voice was strange, compressed, like he was keeping it controlled by effort. "There are federal agents at Gerald's house," he said. "Gerald just called me. He wanted me to come over. He wanted me to call a lawyer he knows." "Don't go over," I said. A beat of silence. "What?" "Do not go to Gerald's house. Do not call Gerald's lawyer. If Gerald needs a lawyer, he needs to call one himself." I paused. "Is Sarah there?" "She's here. Stay home. Both of you. Let Emma go to school normally. Do not make any calls related to Gerald or his situation. Anything you say right now can be made complicated later." Another silence. When Daniel spoke again, his voice had shifted, something in it opening up. Recalibrating. "Richard," he said, "did you know this was coming?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. I knew that Gerald's business activities were being reviewed by people whose job is to review them, I said. I submitted information through a legal channel. That's all I can tell you. The silence lasted a long time. "He grabbed Emma's wrist," I said, "and he called her dramatic." Daniel did not say anything. But I heard him breathe a long, slow exhale, like something he had been holding for a while was finally being released. Gerald Whitmore was arrested that morning on charges related to financial fraud, specifically a scheme involving falsified property valuations used to secure loans, with the proceeds being cycled through a series of shell companies in ways that federal prosecutors would later describe in a 38-page indictment as deliberate, systematic, and sustained over more than 5 years. The full scope of it was larger than what I had submitted. The investigators had been building their own case for some time. What I provided, Patricia told me later, had helped them close a gap in the documentation around 2 specific transactions that had been difficult to pin down. Gerald did not go quietly. He made calls. He called lawyers and former business associates and people he believed owed him favors. He called Daniel 3 more times that day, and Daniel, to his great credit, did not answer. He issued a statement through his attorney the following week that described the charges as a politically motivated mischaracterization of normal business practice. He told people he would be fully vindicated. He was not vindicated. 14 months later, after a trial that took 3 weeks, he was convicted on 7 counts. He was sentenced to 9 years in federal prison. I did not attend the trial. I did not feel the need to. I had done what I set out to do, which was to put accurate information in front of the right people and allow the system I had served for 31 years to work the way it was designed to work. What I cared about was what happened at home. Without Gerald's presence, and without the invisible debt Daniel had been carrying, something in the house on Elmwood Drive changed. Daniel stood straighter. I do not mean this as metaphor, though it was that too. His actual posture changed. Sarah laughed more easily. Emma, who had been quieter than usual for several months, slowly returned to herself over the summer. By August, she was telling long stories again at dinner, leaning forward with that brightness in her eyes, and I watched her and felt something in my chest unknot that I had not realized was still tight. One evening in late August, I was on my back porch with Daniel. Emma was inside helping Sarah with dinner. The sun was going down over the yard, And the tomatoes were coming in better than last year, actually, which I took as a sign of something, though I could not have said what. Daniel had a beer. I had my coffee. We sat without talking for a while. "Can I ask you something?" Daniel said. "Yes." "When did you start?" Looking into him. "February," I said. "After Emma came home with the bruise." He was quiet. I should have done something. "You were managing a complicated situation with limited information," I said. "You were trying to protect your family from a man who had made himself financially significant to you. That is an extremely difficult position. There is no simple move from inside that position. You made a move." "I had different tools," I said, "and I was on the outside. It is easier to see the shape of a thing when you are not inside it." Daniel looked at his hands for a moment. "I owe you." "You owe me nothing," I said. "Emma is my granddaughter. Sarah is my daughter. What I did because it was right. That's the only calculation that matters." He nodded. We sat for a while longer, without talking. The light went slowly out of the sky. Then he said, "What did you do exactly?" "For the IRS. You never really said." "Criminal investigation," I said. "Financial crimes. Tax fraud, money laundering, that kind of work." He processed this. And Gerald never knew that. Gerald knew I worked for the IRS. He assumed that meant I processed tax returns. I paused. Men like Gerald make a particular kind of assumption about quiet people. They assume quiet means simple. It is their most reliable mistake. Daniel was silent for a moment. Then he let out a breath that was almost a laugh. 31 years, he said. 31 years. He shook his head slowly. He really had no idea what he was walking into. "No," I said. "He did not." I want to say something here, before I finish telling this story, because I think it matters. I am not telling this to celebrate what happened to Gerald. A man going to prison is not something I find satisfying in itself, even when it is the right outcome. I spent my career putting people in prison. I know what it costs to the person, to their family, to everyone in the radius. Consequences are not entertainment. They are the last resort of a system that has run out of other options. What I will say is this: I was wrong about one thing. When I retired, I believed that the part of my life that involved this kind of work was finished. I thought I was done. I thought the tools I had spent 3 decades developing were going to rust quietly in a drawer somewhere while I tended my tomatoes and walked my 6 miles every morning and watched my granddaughter grow up in peace. But the tools were still there. And when someone put his hands on my granddaughter and then looked me in the eye and called her dramatic, the tools woke up. I have never regretted using them. Not once. There is a question I have thought about, though. I think about honesty about what I owe the people I love. I did not tell Daniel or Sarah what I was doing while I was doing it. I made a decision to protect them from information that might have put them in a difficult position or caused them to act in ways that could have complicated the investigation. I still believe that was the right call tactically, but I also understand that choosing what to tell the people you love and when is never a simple thing. It is its own kind of responsibility, one that I took seriously and that I would take seriously again, but that I also do not pretend came without cost. They trusted me. I am grateful they were right to. The last thing I want to tell you is about Emma. This past spring, she turned 12. We had a small dinner, just Sarah and Daniel and me, the way she wanted it. After cake, she asked if she could show me something on the piano. She has been taking piano lessons since the fall. Her own decision, a teacher she chose herself after researching 3 different options. She is serious about it in the way 11 and 12-year-olds are serious about things they have genuinely chosen with a focus that adults sometimes forget is possible. She played me a piece. I do not know enough about music to tell you what it was. I know it was short, and that she played it carefully, and that there was one place in the middle where she made a small mistake and paused for just a fraction of a second before continuing without stopping, which is exactly the right thing to do. When she finished, she looked up at me. "Well?" she said. I looked at my granddaughter, 12 years old, bright and capable, and absolutely herself, in the way children are when no one has successfully convinced them to be someone else. "That," I said, "was the best thing I've heard in a very long time." She rolled her eyes, which meant she was pleased. She closed the piano and went to help her mother with the dishes, and I sat there in the quiet room for a moment by myself. I thought about something a supervisor told me in my second year with the agency, a woman named Harriet, who had been doing the job for 20 years and who had seen everything there was to see. She said, "The work matters because the people behind the numbers are real. Never let it become about the numbers. The moment it becomes about the numbers, you have lost something you cannot get back." I never forgot that. Emma is not a number. She is a 12-year-old girl who plays piano carefully and corrects her mistakes without stopping and rolls her eyes when she is pleased. She is my granddaughter, and she is the reason I planted tomatoes again this spring, in the same patch, with the same care, because she told me last year that she liked the way the backyard smelled in August when they were coming in. I used the tools I had. I would use them again. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, reading this, thinking that the quiet person in your life is someone you can afford to dismiss, I would ask you to think again. You never quite know what someone has been carrying all these years, patient and still, waiting for the moment it becomes necessary.